for this webinar, we're really going to be talking about kids with serious sexual behavior problems, ones that they initiate and that are potentially harmful to other, usually younger children. And we're really focused on older youth, ages 13 and up. We want to look at what we can do for these older kids. So this may mean getting them engaged in counseling and their families actively participating in their treatment and safety. That means that we need to talk about what might get in these parents' ways of getting their kids and potentially themselves as well into therapy. So we'll also touch on communicating with others about what's going on as well. And finally, we want to be able to expand our perspective of what youth with sexual behavior problems really need.
Thanks, Micah. Now, to get started, we really need to think about how we talk about youth who are sexually harming other children. Talking about youth, about children with sexual problem behaviors is, of course, really difficult, but when you add in the notion that a youth might be a pedophile complicates this much further. Our fears about talking about sexual behaviors, and just generally even, are really a huge barriers in getting kids help early with their problem behaviors. Because really for many adults, many folks, anyone who acts out sexually with a kid, even if it's another kid, must have something seriously wrong with them, right? Is probably a monster, a pedophile, and really, someone we want to stop, and we don't always think about treatment. This chain of attitudes really sabotages exactly what it is that we want to do. We want to intervene early and successfully with kids whose sexual behaviors, ones that they initiate, are harmful.
Yeah, and really just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I wanted to quickly review the difference between pedophilia and problematic sexual behaviors. We don't automatically give a youth a diagnosis of pedophile just because they've sexually harmed another kid. You'll see the definitions up there on your screen, but the point we really want to drive home here is that most teens who engage in harmful or abusive behavior are not pedophiles, though a small percentage may be. Pedophilia is really only diagnosed, it's only diagnosed by a qualified mental health professional. A teen being evaluated must be at least 16 years old and be attracted to prepubescent youth 13 years of age or younger. And just because a youth is attracted to younger kids, that doesn't mean that they'll be sexually harmful. In fact, many teens do engage in harmful or abusive behaviors towards younger kids and do not meet the criterion for pedophilia. And we actually have heard on our helpline from a few youth, older teenagers, who are themselves acknowledging their sexual attraction for younger children and are quite terrified about their future. And they tell us that they have no intention to harm a child. And these are some kids that we'll talk about just much later in this webinar. Jenny?
I'm sorry, I had muted myself for a second. So what I wanted to let folks know that we realize that, while we've titled this webinar, Is My Child a Pedophile? This really isn't so much about youth with problematic sexual behaviors due to pedophilic interests, but about youth sexual behaviors that are harming other children and themselves without that diagnosis. And there's such a huge range of sexual behaviors that children and youth engage in. We've tackled this topic in our webinar series before, but we really want to put this out again under a little bit of a different lens, focusing more specifically on how we can help families think about helping their son or daughter who has sexually harmed another child. So just a quick glimpse into the scope of this. Youth with problem sexual behaviors can really run the gamut. On our helpline, we hear calls from parents with questions such as, how do I help my 8-year-old who won't stop trying to touch his younger brother's private parts, to what do I do about my 12-year-old who's recording herself masturbating and sending that to her younger cousins, to my 16-year-old has sexually abused his sister. How does my family recover? Now, so as we stated for this webinar, we are primarily talking about youth sexual problem behaviors that have harmed another child and that are older. We also want to share that 20 to 25% of cases handled by children's advocacy centers involve youth or children under the age of 18 who have sexually harmed another child. Now, across the data, we find that really over a third cases, and mostly studies cite 30 to 50% of sexual abuse reported involves child-to-child behaviors, primarily of one youth sexually harming another youth. Studies have also shown that the referral rates for children who exhibit problematic sexual behaviors has increased significantly in the recent years, and this is despite a downward trend among other age groups. And this is signaling really a growing recognition of problem sexual behaviors among children. Adolescents account for nearly 17% of arrests for all sex crimes annually. Now, the most recent research on sexual recidivism for juveniles with sexual offenses is encouragingly low, at about 3%. But quite honestly, I've seen studies that range from 1.9% all the way up to 21, 22%. But again, most experts do typically quote 3 to 5%. And of course, we just don't know what we don't know. The research on juveniles who sexually abuse younger children really is fairly limited at this point. But we do know that the data indicates that the peak age of persons accused of sexual offenses against children is age 13, which is a rate of about 120 per 100,000. And this drops off rapidly by about half at age 18. So this just pretty much captures what we hear, right? My kid has hurt others. I'm scared for them and for my other children. Is there help? Can my child be helped? This is the crux of the questions that we get on our helpline from parents whose child has sexually harmed another child. Not surprising, we really do hear the fear for one's own child who is committing the sexual harm and the fear for other children, maybe in their family, maybe friends of the family, other family relatives, the fear for the whole family. Families experiencing this really, they just have so many questions and are really confused about where to turn next. More specifically on your screen, we wanted to share the questions that we do hear from parents on the helpline regarding their kids' sexual problem behaviors. They run that gamut of how to address the behaviors, how to take care of everyone's safety in the family, how to be a responsible parent, and how to protect their child, and also just how to deal with their own reactions. We know that engaging families to help children is always a best practice, but in these situations, it's just not always as clear-cut what the next steps are.
So to really help us think about these questions and how to engage with these families, let us welcome our guest expert, Becky Palmer. She is a clinician, private consultant, and trainer out of Chicago who has spent her career working with and on behalf of survivors, parents of sexually abused and reactive children, and youth who have sexually abused. Formerly the Senior VP of Clinical at Alternative Behavior Treatment Centers, Becky has presented trainings and workshops around the globe and was adjunct faculty at Illinois School of Professional Psychology. She has consulted with and providing trainings for the many professionals involved with youth, including probation and parole officers, attorneys, judges, foster parents, child care workers, and other therapists. Welcome, Becky. We are so glad to have you with us here today.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So I'm going to start out and just read our first letter. This is from a parent wondering why their teen engaged in sexually harmful behavior. They said, my 16-year-old son has been exposing himself to his younger sisters. Last month, he asked a younger girl to put her mouth on his penis. She didn't do this, but thankfully she went and told someone about it. What can be going on with him? Can anything cure him? I feel like his life is about to be ruined. So really often before actually taking steps to address behaviors, parents need a better understanding of what's going on with their child. You know, with more understanding, we find that parents can show up more compassionately and even comfortably. So, Becky, let's just start right in with the big question most parents have, which is the why. This person on our last email was really wondering what might be going on for their son. You know, we've already noted that it's probably unlikely that there is a pedophilia diagnosis at play. So in general, why do youth engage in sexual harmful behaviors? Are youth sexually harmful behaviors like adult sexually abusive behaviors?
No, in fact, a lot of juveniles are very, very different than the adults when it comes to those behaviors. You know, one of the things maybe is that he's curious and hasn't had a good sex education. Another might be is that he is aroused, but he also doesn't know what to do about it. Again, doesn't know that this is normal or thinks he's abnormal. So being able to communicate about that is really important for these youth.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Jenny, let's just slide in what all these possible causes we have up there. You know, we hear sometimes that other mental health concerns could be an underlying issue. You know, drug and alcohol use and abuse certainly can cloud decision making and even hinder the ability for teens to kind of see when someone else is sending signals that they're uncomfortable. And we know that sometimes even previous exposure to victimization, sexual abuse, physical violence, or even sometimes pornography, as we hear about on our helpline, can play a role in harmful behaviors.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to delve a little deeper into that correlation between access that I saw in a recent study to online inappropriate material, that over half of the children in the study who had instigated problem sexual behaviors had viewed sexually explicit materials. The researchers found that there was an association between viewing and subsequent initiation of invasive sexual acts. And, you know, of course, they were clear. The viewing of sexually explicit media does not cause these behaviors, but the correlation does provide us with more information to consider regarding both prevention and treatment. So, Becky, anything you want to add to that?
I think that our youth are up against something that, you know, previous generations haven't been, and that's been access to pornography, which can, over time, normalize or affirm that this is how you're supposed to be behaving. And I think that as parents, and professionals, we haven't spent enough time having that conversation with our kids about the use of the internet and pornography.
We couldn't agree more. Yeah, thank you so much. All right, well, let's actually move on, because I want to read this next question that we got. Dear Helpline, my 16-year-old son has been exposing himself to his younger sisters. About a year ago, he asked a younger girl to put her mouth on his penis, and she didn't do this, but thankfully she went and told someone about it. He's been seeing a counselor since the first episode. What can be going on with him? Can anything cure him? I feel like his life is about to be ruined. You know, again, since it's so difficult for parents to think about their children's sexual problem behaviors, it can feel like there's nothing that can be done. And we need to build up their hope and optimism so they don't just feel resigned to having a kid whose sexual behaviors are harmful and abusive to others, and who might just end up, you know, like an outcast in society, locked up with no life. So, Becky, our next question for you really is there help for kids who are sexually harming other children? And I know that unfortunately we don't have as much research as there should be, but how do you answer this question for parents? And, you know, how can we help these parents see hope?
I think here's why it's really hopeful, is because kids are changing and kids are growing. And I think the discovery of that child's behavior is actually a signal and an opportunity. The opportunity to talk about it, the opportunity to talk about feelings, and to be involved in helping your child grow and change. I think that's the hopeful part. And I think parents need to be seen as part of the team that's going to help the child.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what do we tell them, though, about what kind of therapy or treatment's available? I mean, this isn't a clinical training, and I don't mean to, you know, let's roll out all of the modalities, you know, but just briefly, what does treatment for kids with sexual behavior problems, particularly those that are initiating harmful behaviors towards other kids, what does that look like?
Well, a lot of kids end up being involved in some group treatment, but I think what's really important for parents and professionals to understand are what are some of the common treatment goals, would also then help us understand what sort of treatment does the youth need. So some common treatment goals are to accept responsibility for their behaviors, begin to identify what some of the contributing factors are, explore and utilize effective coping strategies, develop pro-social skills and competencies, establish positive peer relationships, and promote healthy family functioning. And so when we know what those treatment goals are, then we can take a look at, so what sort of treatment is going to benefit this youth? Is it individual treatment to address some of these issues? Will it be group treatment to address some of these issues? Or will it be family treatment to address some of these issues?
That makes a lot of sense. Great, thank you for sharing that. I think that really helps folks get a good framework of just how we can begin to approach this work.
Yeah. And, while we're kind of talking about therapy, I wanted to just quickly ask a little bit more about specialized treatment and how to find a good therapist to work with a youth who's engaging in abusive behaviors. So Becky, what kind of a therapist should parents look for when it comes to abusive behaviors? What are some of the traits or, even the things that we're looking for when we're specifically looking for problematic sexual behavior help?
Well, I think the first thing that I've recognized in all of my years of working with families is that when parents call for treatment, they're anxious, they're afraid, they're scared, and they just do what someone has told them to do instead of feeling like they have the capacity to ask questions and discover what kind of therapist is going to be working with my child. Would be so to help parents understand that, are you comfortable, the therapist is comfortable working with a youth who's committed a sexual offense? What sorts of training have they had in working with youth with this sort of problem? What does their treatment program look like? And to really interview the therapist before making a decision.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. And that's something that we often talk about is making sure that not only are the qualifications correct, but that this person feels like someone who's going to connect with their child specifically. Because you can have, all the qualifications in the world, but if it's not a good match, it's really not going to go much of anywhere.
Correct.
So yeah, thank you. And let's keep talking about this family engagement. So our next letter, dear Helpline, my middle daughter is 14, started therapy after getting caught touching her sister's, full typo there. My sister's toddler over time. Just the other day, I caught her as she was trying to get another child alone during our barbecue. I only walked away for 2 seconds, nothing happened, but it doesn't feel like counseling is working and I'm worried. What should I be doing right now to be supportive while also being real about my daughter's risk? How will I know if she's getting better? So Becky, as a clinician myself who's worked with youth, I certainly recognize that if parents are available, my work has always been to include them. And I've always felt that initial engagement, that first meeting, how I began the relationship with the parents was like really critical. It was such an opportunity to hook folks in. And I know that we also have to give youth, the right to confidential and private therapy, and we're balancing how to include the parents. So, how should mom or dad participate in counseling? And how do you talk to parents when you're first beginning to see a new youth client? And what do you say to them to acclimate them to experience what the expectations are? So I know there's 2 questions there. First, how do you introduce counseling and what to expect? And how should parents participate?
Well, specifically when I'm working with a family that's first come to me, this is how I explain what I'm going to do and how my program works. One is that, first of all, your child is probably going to need some individual therapy to address some of their specific issues. Also, the family's going to need some treatment. Families are greater than the sum of its parts. It's, I think that's the hopeful part for me is that when families are engaged and working with the therapist and their child, we have, I think, a greater chance of the child developing the self-confidence that they need and being able to manage any of their behaviors that have gotten them into trouble up to this point. And so I would say that, ideally, and I know that it's not always possible, but ideally, I think having the individual therapist not be the same as the family therapist. I think that's a real challenge, because then the kid doesn't always feel like they can be as open as maybe they would like to be if the person's also going to be working with the parents. The other thing that I really tell kids is, everything that we talk about is confidential, and I explain to them the things that will not be confidential. And then I explain to them the issues that if I think that they're important for their parents to know, I will let them know that, and then we'll figure out in individual therapy how the parents will find out and how you will tell them. And generally, kids are pretty cooperative with that. And then I also tell that to parents. Say, if there's something I think you need to know, you can't just pick up the phone and call me, but we'll be working on it, and in time we'll tell you. And parents seem to be able to feel some relief that they will eventually be involved in that process.
Right. Although it makes me wonder, what about parents who are difficult to engage, that even though they may say, I'm here, and I don't mean to be negative, I just spent 20 years in the system, so I've worked with parents across the spectrum, and even folks who are really well-intentioned don't always know how to show up. Are there any ways to kind of gently push parents along to get more involved, when they often think, it's my kid that's the problem, you should be fixing them? How can we, what are some strategies to pull them in?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, because yes, there will be some families on that fringe who will say, it's my kid's the one that needs to be changed. What I say to those parents is, look, you know your child better than I do. Here's what I know. I know how to work with kids and families who have this problem, but I don't know your child like you do, and I'm going to need your expertise on your child so that we can all help your child.
Yeah, that's a good point, to really help them feel that, yeah, they're bringing necessary information and experience that nobody else has.
Absolutely. They're the experts on that child.
Right. Now, what about the parents then that are frustrated and say, it's not working, my kid's not changing, there's been another incident? Yeah, how do we address those concerns?
Well, I think that's two questions. How do I know if my kid is changing? I think that is an excellent question to be asking the therapist up front. How will I know? How will we know when risk is less of my child doing this again? And then secondly, I think it's important to have that be clear. Who wants to go to therapy and keep spending money and not know what it's supposed to look like when this is done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right. Thank you so much. Let's get to our next. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I can understand that, having those expectations kind of set up front and kind of knowing what milestones need to be met can be really helpful for a lot of parents, rather than just kind of moving through a fog and kind of not knowing where to go, or, how to know when it's working.
Right.
So, really from all that you've been saying, getting treatment and family engagement, we can see is really, really critical. And in that same respect, for many parents, just like the email that I'm about to read, even just getting to that step can be really scary. So this parent says, I just walked in on my 16-year-old making my youngest put his mouth on her genitals. I know that something needs to happen, and I know that this is really serious, but if I reach out for help, both my kids will get taken away, or my older daughter, she'll get sent to jail. What should I do? I feel like I'm in an impossible situation, and I'm so scared right now. So we can hear so many barriers in this letter, right? And we hear frequently on our helpline, similar concerns from parents who really say that they haven't yet reached out for help, even if their child is actively harming other children, because they're really afraid that the therapist will have to call the police or call social services, and then either their child who's causing the harm or the other children in the family are going to get taken away. So really they're worried about arrest, they're worried about their kid's future, and that their family is going to be forever changed.
Mhm.
So Becky, what can we tell parents who are worried about these possible outcomes? How can we talk about the benefits of reaching out for help in a way that helps address some of these underlying concerns?
Well, I think the first step is to really have some compassion for the parents. It's really, and I'm probably showing my age when I use this as an example, but it's a Sophie's choice. Which child do I choose here? When in fact they're feeling worried and anxious for all their children. And I think when parents understand that the helper has that understanding, they're much more likely to engage in working together. Look, we can't prevent uh, the legal system from being involved because once they were mandated reporters. On the other hand, I like to tell parents that and this is true in my experience, that when they contact me first, I tell them, here's what we will have to do, and I will walk with you through this process. I think that knowing that someone will walk through that process with them, regardless of what's going to happen, uh, gives them some relief and support. And on the other hand, I think also a lot of the legal system has a tendency to say, oh, look, this parent's already starting to take care of it. Maybe this is a positive thing. They're already involved with getting help. So I like to share that with parents as well, that it's a better thing to get help than to not get help. Because at some point, someone's going to find out. Or if they don't find out, what will be the consequences of no one ever finding out?
Yeah. Yeah, just kind of reframing it for them on, just how beneficial it can be and walking with them through the process. Absolutely.
Yeah, really helpful.
So just to recap from our last letter writer, they were really describing some of the barriers about the worries and the fears around criminal justice involvement, which is a common theme. The possibility that CPS might get involved and remove kids from the home. But that's not all that parents might be concerned about under the surface. Some folks who, contact us on the helpline are able to pretty clearly articulate all that they're worried about. We had one person who told us that it would be easier to say that her son is a murderer than a child sex abuser. We've also had another person who said that they would take their child up to Canada so that his records didn't follow him for the rest of his life. But then there are also other times where we have to listen more acutely for really what's getting in the parent's way. We may be able to hear that something is holding them back, and we kind of have to dive a little deeper to see what exactly that is. So, Becky, we briefly talked on some of the things that might be holding people back. But what about the more emotional barriers? The stigma, the fears of labeling, the guilt, the shame. What would you say to parents who are reluctant to get help, more because they're afraid that their child will be labeled as being a monster or a pedophile? How can that guilt and shame prevent a parent from reaching out?
Well, I think it bleeds over into like extended family and into the community. It's like, oh, now everybody knows, and this is what they think of my child. And sadly, I think that's been one of the unintended consequences of the registry that exists, and why parents want to take their children to Canada to avoid that. Also, I think the more emotional piece that you're alluding to is, this happened to me as a child. I can't even deal with it, and that's probably true. I think that's probably a really honest statement. And in that respect, I think I would offer that parent some of their own therapy to help them deal with it, because they're also a parent and they have to help their child. Counseling is too expensive. I hear that a lot. I think every therapist has to help them figure out what's the best way to proceed. I know that I talk ideally about the youth being in individual treatment and group treatment and family treatment, and you can just see the dollar signs rolling around.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think it's when you can talk about your program. Well, first of all, it's not individual treatment every week. It may be group every week for a certain amount of time, and it won't be family therapy every week. And so it's how do we intersperse that and help the family know how much this is going to cost financially. And even more so, now with so many people out of work, how they're not going to be able to afford it. How are we going to help these families?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, no, I
really
really
important.
appreciate that. And I can imagine that one other barrier that we didn't quite touch on is just the parent really worrying that this is all their fault and that this is going to, more than on their child, reflect poorly on them and how they raise their child, and what is everyone going to think. So what can you or what do you say to parents who bring that up as one of their concerns, or who you can read that as kind of what is their main concern below the surface?
Well, I think when parents tell me that, the first thing that I say to them is, well, first of all, it's not all your fault. If you insist on saying that it's all your fault, then you're disallowing your child from taking responsibility for their own choices and behaviors. So let's figure out what parts you may have contributed to this. Were you working too much? Were you unavailable? When he wanted to talk about sex, you couldn't do it. I mean, what parts are you responsible for? But it's not all your fault.
Yeah, I really
And I think,
appreciate that. You're not like disavowing them from having some role in this because they are the ones doing the parenting, but also to problem solve. How can you fix it to help in the future? How can you recognize what you fell short on, so that you can do a little bit better?
right.
Yeah, and it's
And
not
fix the
about
things that they can
blaming the
fix.
family. I'm sorry, Becky. I was just trying to say that it's clearly not about blaming the parents, but kind of recognizing that we all have a role in how we keep each other safe and how we address when safety has become a concern and when somebody hasn't been safe.
Right. And I think it's really important that we as professionals understand that every parent, almost every parent, has that experience. I mean, it's not any different than if your kid is failing at school, you feel like it's all your fault.
Mm-hmm.
If your kid hurts another kid, beats them up on the playground, you feel like it's all your fault. That's a normal parental reaction. But to not let your child take some responsibility for their behavior is not going to help that change.
Right. Really important points, and I thank both of you for this discussion, because I know that the more that we can help folks who are in position working with parents, advocates, parent aides, certainly therapists, teachers, even coaches, all of these folks, I think that there is this huge barrier that if you're not in that parent's shoes, you have this image of how you would respond. And yet, when you're faced with a parent who has so many barriers about what's the next step, they're trying to make sure that they're keeping their family intact. They have their own internal reactions and dialogue going, whether they're a survivor or they've experienced, other trauma in their family, the guilt. It's just, if we can't, I love that you had used earlier the word about compassion for parents, because we really need to hold that place in order to help the whole family, help the children and the youth to be able to make safer decisions, have, I don't know, safer environments. So I really appreciate the focus on that, both accountability and compassion. So moving on.
Great. Yeah, so there's just, one last barrier that we wanted to talk about. We have the parents who really feel, understandably, as this parent does, who says, this parent says, my niece who's 6 told her mom and me that my oldest son who's 17 sexually abused her. I was shocked. I'm still shaking with anger as I type this. How could he do such a thing? I feel so disgusted and ashamed. I can't even look at him right now, and honestly, I don't know how I can approach this rationally. So really with the focus and the importance of family engagement, we have to understand that parents often have layers of feelings and responses that we're kind of just going over. And one of those responses is that the protective parent kicks in. You know, they want to protect their child who's harmed another from really harsh punishment. They want to advocate on their child's behalf and get their child help. But there are also other responses that are just as natural to hearing that anyone has harmed a child. You know, and especially in a sexual way, you know, the feelings of anger, disgust, or even just wondering, you know, what they did wrong, as we just talked about. So Becky, what do these parents need? How can we help them with their own internal responses to their child's harmful sexual behaviors?
Well, the thing that I will do with parents would be to, one, tell them that that's kind of a normal feeling, that you might have those feelings about your child right now. And what do you think, you know, give the parent a chance to figure out what are they supposed to do with that, you know, in light of the fact that they're also the parent and they're going to need to help their child. You know, where can they have this conversation and talk about their feelings of disgust and shame? And then asking them, if you can't let go of that feeling, how is that going to help your child?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Just helping them problem solve a way to still be able to have those feelings, express those feelings in a way that is, in a way that's helpful to the family dynamic, you know, that's not going to be in front of their child. So how can they get those supports to talk about this with someone, and eventually hopefully work to kind of heal from those feelings as well?
Yeah. And, you know, I want to add, I think it's so important for people to get permission to feel really lousy feelings about people they love, that we're often just kind of held to some internal standard that we can't ever hate our children. And we probably don't, but we hate their behaviors. And they worry that, but parents just don't always have the language, I think, for them to recognize that you can have all your feelings. It's just like what we say to kids, it's how you manage them. And we don't want to take those away. There's grieving, you know, as part of this. There is fear. And it's just so important that we help folks acknowledge that they need to have a safe place to have all of the feelings that they have. So,
You know, can I add one more thing to
please.
to this question that I'm thinking of, because I've had this call in this situation so many times, because it's within the family. It's not a sibling. It looks like it's a cousin. A lot of the feelings also center around extended family, and what, you know, the parents' anger is about, look what you've done to our family.
Yeah.
Does this mean that my sister will never ever come over again? Will we never, you know, and people start choosing sides. And so really helping the parent understand that, one, the feeling is normal, and how can we help the family get through this?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for adding that. I hadn't really thought about it in that dynamic, but yeah, I can see how that families would. You've ruined our whole family. You've ruined my whole life. You know, I mean, it can really get quite expanded. All right, great. Let's move on. And I see lots of great questions, by the way, piling up in chat. Some of them are still coming up in the content, but it looks like to me we'll definitely have time to get to many of these. So just giving both you, Micah and Becky, a heads up that we got some good questions out here. Did I? Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Go ahead. Oh, no, it's me, huh? So yeah, so actually this is what I realized as we're doing this webinar. I need to roll it back a little bit. We didn't really start with talking about the first steps, like right after there's been an incident that's happened. We dive right into family involvement and the importance that has on successful outcomes. But I do want to kind of revisit addressing kind of those first moments and then subsequent next steps that there's a problem, and we need to help this kid, my kid, out. What can we tell parents to do, really? I mean, this writer that you have their letter up on your screen, a friend of mine who's the mother of a 4-year-old told me that her daughter reporting being molested by my teenage boy. He's 14 years old. I need help to handle the situation in the most appropriate way with my son. What do I do next? Now, we've looked at our helpline data, and one of the things that actually really strikes us is that many folks call us before they've reached out to a therapist, to the police, to child protection, to maybe somebody else trusted at their doctor, a school teacher. And they're wondering, what do I do now? I just found this out last night.
Yeah, so that's really where we want to land on, because adults absolutely can take steps immediately to reassure everyone within the family that they want all folks to be safe. And while, they know that this may not have been the case, previously, it will be now. It's really the adult's job to do everything they can to keep the family safe. And this certainly means looking at everything, from assessing the physical environment, getting professionals to help the family together and individually, and even things like activities in school. We really need to assess what needs to be strengthened and what could be added or adaptive in terms of safety planning. What does the child who's harming other children need in terms of communication and definition regarding their behaviors and the rules as well? It's also important to look at things like the layout of the house, bedroom and bathroom use, and even times that adults are around or not around to supervise. Some or all of these things need to be changed. So really thoughtful consideration and rules about privacy, rules about dressing, sleeping, and even after school activities should be clarified and modified as needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not suggesting that anybody does this on their own. I mean, it is really important for folks. It's a process. We learn more about what's been going on, what the youth need. And we have to look at the child who has been harmed. If they're living in the same house with a youth who has initiated harmful behaviors, sometimes we do need to think about separating children. I've certainly worked with many families where one of the children did need to go live actually in a separate residence, maybe if the parents were separated or with grandparents, just as first steps of getting professionals in to work with the family commence. Throughout this process, the importance of communication, as always, is just so important. How we talk to the kid who has initiated sexual harmful behaviors is pretty key. I mean, how we communicate the impact of his or her behaviors and what's going to happen next, from house rules all the way up to possible involvement with the police or authorities if necessary. Maybe if there's going to be a lawyer involved, what to expect from that. We talk about things like the possibility of having to separate the youth from younger children so that we're not saying you're a monster and we need to remove you, but we have language that both holds them, helps them feel supported and safe, not abandoned, but lets them know that we need to follow up on the seriousness and safety concerns of what's happened, and that the job of all the adults involved is to focus on making sure moving forward that everyone is safe. And of course, we do this with support and compassion. And in fact, our early conversations are almost similar, like when a survivor who first discloses their abuse and needs to be believed and know that they're supported and that they're safe moving forward, a youth who's been found to be sexually abusing a sibling or another child really needs reassurance that they are loved and supported, and that, again, they're not going to be abandoned, and that the adults in their lives are going to do what's right to help them be safe with their behaviors. This doesn't mean, of course, that we're trying to excuse this youth's behaviors, that they shouldn't be held accountable, but instead we want to convey that message that we can really bridge both safety and accountability with understanding and help. Becky, what would you add to that? When we first are having a conversation, when the parents are first in that position of, and for lack of a better word, confronting their teenager about harmful sexual behaviors, how do you think we can roll out that conversation? What are some considerations that we should all be keeping in mind?
I think it's important for the parent to say what they know and what they don't know. Say, I don't know everything about this. I also know that we're going to figure this out. We will be talking to people who are professionals, who have a better understanding of this than I do, and we're going to let them help us figure out how to not have this happen again. And I think it's about just being honest with your kid. You don't have to shame them, though many kids feel shamed. You don't have to hate them or be angry with them. I think it's just real clear what your expectation is as a parent is we're going to figure this out.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think? I've always felt that it's okay for a parent to say, I do feel mad right now and worried, and I still love you, and being mad doesn't mean that we don't work together as a family. But, something about how can parents own their own feelings in a way that's honest, kind of modeling for a child, but still in control. You know what I mean?
I think it's perfectly okay. Why wouldn't a parent be mad? I mean, that's why the kid probably didn't tell them because they thought their parent would be mad. I'm mad. I'm really angry right now. I'm angry that you behaved in this way and you hurt someone else.
Mm-hmm.
But I also am understanding that maybe you're hurting and we have to talk about this and we have to figure it out. I think it's all right for parents to be angry and to tell their kid that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what about though talking with family and friends close to the youth? Like, what if somebody asks, what's going on with your son? I heard he messed with little Timmy. So we actually even have in our chat a question about talking to others in the community, teachers or coaches or, pastors who are leading youth groups. So what can we tell the adults who are in our youth's lives about what's going on? I know that's really broad, but a couple of quick tips.
I think that, first of all, I don't think there's a one answer to that. I think a lot of it depends on who that other adult is. I think it depends on how that adult is involved in my child's life. I also, as a parent, want to assess, is this a place where my child is at risk for offending? If it's a youth group and it's all the same age kids at the church, then maybe that's not a place where he's at risk, but maybe it is when there's a family gathering. So I think it's assessing, and I would do that with a therapist. I would kind of break down who the different people are. I mean, particularly if your child is not, hasn't been charged and isn't on the registry, I don't know that there's any reason that the school knows unless you think that's going to be a problem for the kid at school.
That's really helpful. And in fact, it's funny, as I was asking this question, a question came in on the chat. And, hey, Kathy, thanks for your question. Exactly how much do you share with the other family members? And is it prudent to survey other kids in the family to assess whether there's been victims as well? And then she notes we have a responsibility to the other family members to ensure that they're aware of the possible danger. So I think you mostly replied to that, but I just wanted to see if there was any there is this question about assessing whether there's been other victims in the family. Mm-hmm. And that's a little beyond the scope of this, but I'm wondering if you have something you'd like to add to that.
I think I would be pretty sensitive to what I share with other family members because I think people in general, one of our not good strengths is when something bad happens, people are looking for someone to blame or a scapegoat. And so I think you just have to be really careful. And yes, I agree that family members do have the right to know, but do they have a right to know just to know or a right to know because it's a safety issue? If it's a safety issue, then I think I would talk about it in terms of safety. Mm-hmm. What parts do they need to know in terms of safety? Like, we're coming over, but Johnny is going to stay up here with the adults. He's not allowed to go downstairs and play ping pong with the younger kids.
Which is an interesting point to me too, because I think we can often set limits on behaviors, and we're not necessarily obligated to tell somebody why. sometimes that's helpful and it makes sense, and you have a close enough relationship, it feels safe. And other times they don't, we're working with our son on some problems, and so he needs to be in our supervision all the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Everyone's not entitled to everything that you know.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you. And so we did want to, let's see, just touch a little bit on reporting. You actually mentioned this as well, Becky. And, we do, as I said, hear from a lot of folks who've contacted us before reaching out to any authorities or professionals. And, we always strongly, in fact, this is one of our goals, to get folks to a live person. We emphasize the importance of getting a therapist for the youth whose behaviors are harmful, as well as, of course, for other family members. And parents do ask then about the therapist having to make a report, which you addressed. And I appreciate the model that you shared, because we do a very similar strategy. We coach the parent to make their own report to Child Protection Services. We suggest they notify CPS if they've been informed, maybe by us, to let them know about a situation in their home and what they're doing about it. And, we advise that they factually describe their child's behaviors that have harmed another child, and that they're seeking professional help, that they've called therapists or they're working with other counseling resources, and that they're addressing safety by home, and give any examples. So just, I almost cut in earlier, but I knew that I was going to be coming to this point, that it's really, I think when we can help empower parents to take the lead. I mean, my 20 years, maybe 30 years in the system has been, when I've worked with CPS intake, that there's a whole different response when a parent calls up saying, here's what's going on and here's what I'm doing, as opposed to somebody having to make that report that's not really working in the family. It can shape CPS's response to the situation.
Absolutely. And I would have to say, it shapes it 100% of the time.
Yeah.
I think that Child Protective Services is relieved that the parent has reached out to someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they feel like, okay, this parent knows what they're supposed to be doing. It's real different when you get a call from a therapist saying, guess what, I have to make this report, or a teacher from school, or another family member, because then there's an assumption that the parent has something to hide.
Right, and that's a darn shame that there's that assumption, but yes, I think that's indeed the case. And I also think that this is an opportunity to begin to set a stage for a different kind of partnership between authorities and family, which to me is a huge step towards prevention, that we need to start seeing authorities, and that includes CPS and the police, as partners, who can be pro-family and actually helpful. But we need to take some steps towards that. Obviously authorities have their training needs, and all that we can do to help parents also not see them as the enemy, I think could be a really helpful thing that we can all do. So,
yep.
My wishes, if I was in charge of everything.
Yep.
All right, so we should probably keep moving.
Yeah, we're getting pretty close to the end, but we still wanted to take this audience on a quick side journey. So what about the youth who themselves is recognizing that they may be experiencing or doing something that could be or already is harmful? As Jenny said in the beginning, we've heard from youth who are bravely looking for help for themselves after viewing online child sexual abuse material, like this individual who says, I'm almost 16 and female, and I've been looking for jailbait photos online. I get curious sometimes, and I've seen child porn. It scared me, and I usually close the page immediately, but I always go back. I need help. I'm panicking, and I'm shaky, and I don't know what to do. So I want to acknowledge that this is a really quick toe dip. It deserves a much bigger discussion, and in so many ways, it offers us opportunities for earlier and earlier interventions. But we really wanted to share this voice because these kids and their parents do call us and reach out to us. And as they struggle to be accountable and reach out, we also need to call out the importance of professionals, which many of you are, responding to these kids appropriately as well. So when someone reaches out to us, or anyone for the first time about anything that they feel is either unsayable or shameful, the reaction that they get absolutely can shape what they do next. Meaning in this case, whether they continue to engage in abusive behaviors or potentially seek out treatment or counseling and make a safety plan, whether they decide that it was not worth it to share this part of themselves or take that first step to understanding that they're able to change their behavior. So I think that the interesting part is that so much of what we've said during this webinar can also apply to youth who are worried about their own thoughts and behaviors. Even if they themselves might be struggling with attractions to children or online child sexual abuse material viewing. This doesn't mean that everything is going to be the same, but we still want to show up with care and compassion, and we want to clearly discuss consequences of their harmful behaviors. There is help for youth who are noticing attractions to younger kids, and certainly getting that support in there early can be really critical, especially when they're engaging in risky or even abusive behaviors. When people feel hopeless or they feel like they're shunned, they're more likely to make unsafe choices. So on our helpline, we talk to youth about how to access supports through their parents. I know a lot of kids may not be ready to talk about what's bothering them, but they still are able to ask their parents to speak to a counselor. And we also talk about how they can stay safe and get accurate information about sex and sexual relationships. Again, this is just the beginning of a much larger conversation. But I'm curious, Becky, is there anything else that we should know about these kids who are aware that they're struggling and who are looking for help for their own thoughts, feelings, and potentially their behaviors as well?
I think that, first of all, I think that's pretty courageous for a kid to step out and call and see if they can get help about that. I think in most states, if I'm not mistaken, kids can actually see a therapist 3 times before parents have to know. I would encourage the child to talk with a therapist and talk about what all of that means. It sounds like that's a pretty big thing for them, that they've had to work up the courage to call for help.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to, and for all you therapists who are listening today, if you can't talk about it, the kid's not going to talk about it, because they are at this point, when they step out to seek help, they're pretty hypervigilant. And if they suspect that you're uncomfortable or you're embarrassed or you're ashamed or you don't know, they will probably not share what they're thinking or feeling with you. And so for therapists, I think it's really important to get yourself educated and know what kids are looking at and what that's about, and how you can intervene and help them.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that this is its own webinar, and in fact, it's an area of special focus for us is around primary prevention, is helping younger and younger folks who are recognizing struggles with their own boundaries, their attractions, their impulses, or decision-making skills that are causing them to initiate harm. And yeah, it's wicked, there's my New England, wicked courageous for these kids to reach out. And I think that it can take some people by surprise. So it's a little different than what we've been talking about, but we also recognize that these kids may have families that they're preparing to talk to, or they're wondering if their family finds out, will they be thrown out, or how they'll actually respond to them. And so the more that we can, this may sound weird, but the more that we can prepare parents to show up for their kids, regardless of who their kids, or regardless of what their kids need to disclose to them. I just always believe that first response is so big, and it's going to set the tone for a kid who says, all right, this freaked people out, but they didn't run away. They said they want to show up for me and that I'm still a good person. Yep. And that sets the rest of the tone for me. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Becky, we really appreciated your willingness to answer all of these questions. And I have to tell you that the chat really has been hopping, and this is exactly why we added 15 minutes today, so that we could have a little bit more time. And some of these questions, I wish we could have, I could have both read it and done the webinar at the same time, because they're going to back us up a little bit on some of the things we've talked about. But, I want to share that somebody just wrote out of New Hampshire that their CPS has decided they'll no longer be screening in child-on-child sexual abuse in the home. They're not sure when the shift will happen, and their agency is now thinking about how they're going to be connected with the families who need assistance. So I'm puzzled by that and want to do a little investigation after this about what that's about. But have you heard of this anywhere?
I myself have not heard that. That's concerning to me because I don't know what the laws are then for mandated reporters. I want to check that out. I mean, I understand it, and I think that over the years, the 40 years that I've worked with Child Protective Services and Child and Family Services, it seems to kind of go in cycles. Like when they get overwhelmed, then there's certain things that they don't report anymore. And I think this bears some investigating.
Yeah, I do too. So thanks. Just I wasn't. Yeah, I don't quite know what to say. I just wanted to share that for this whole group, and so I hope folks are all aware of any changes like that, and certainly gather with other professionals and talk about this and what's going to be needed to really help them families who are dealing with their child in the home who could be acting out sexually.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So another one I saw a little earlier in our presentation was that regarding why kids act out in sexually harmful ways, do harmful behaviors come just from curiosity, or wouldn't they have to have been at least exposed to sexual material in order to act out in a sexually harmful way? So I think that's.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the main question here is it's kind of what we say to parents often about younger children's behaviors, that kids really can have a very active make-believe life, but they usually incorporate situations and characters that they've become familiar with because someone talked to them about princesses or dragons or something, castles. And so if I understand this person's question right, it's, do older kids then have to have seen something depicting serious sexual behaviors in order for them to follow through on their curiosity, or is their curiosity enough to lead them to cross boundaries with younger children?
Well, that's a puzzler. I think it's probably a combination of things. One, I think we have to be careful as adults what kind of labels we put on what kids are doing. We automatically call it harmful, and I think we have to understand, well, what was harmful. And then secondly, I think I would have to ask the kid, how did they know to do this? And I think that the third thing, and probably more importantly, is what the sexual behavior that they engaged in, is that like something like no 8-year-old would know about?
Right.
If it's something that 8-year-olds like playing doctor, most 8-year-olds know about that.
Right, exactly.
But if they're simulating sexual intercourse, most 8-year-olds don't. So then I would say, oh, gee, now that's out of proportion to what the kid should know. So developmentally, what does the child know?
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. Okay, I'm still kind of going through the chat a little bit. I do want to comment, somebody had pointed out child pornography should be referred to as child sexual abuse imagery, and we agree, and we typically do refer to CSAM. Occasionally we do revert back to language, just trying to make sure that everybody understands, and we didn't pause as we typically do to clarify that. So thank you so much for drawing some attention to that question. I also wanted you to know, Becky, that I just read a quote coming right back to it. If you can't talk about it, they won't talk about it. So important. Too many parents don't have positive sex education backgrounds. I hope this month of awareness goes viral. It still seems like there's such a small exposure. And this person went on to talk about the difficulty in their Head Start program and talking about sexual behaviors even between younger kids. So I think you made a big impact to that comment. Thank you.
Sure.
I also know that I saw a question, it's a little bit beyond what we're doing, and we do have resources for folks, but asking about providing some guidance on curious behaviors versus harmful behaviors. Is there, anything that you'd like to say kind of briefly to help folks identify when the flag is up?
Well, I think, if we think back to like even Tony Kavanaugh Johnson's work early on, her and Bill Friedrich's work, it's like when it becomes known to the adult that the child has engaged in this behavior, how do they respond to the adult? Like, oh, okay, I won't do that anymore. Or they're ashamed, or they cry, or they're afraid. What's the child's response when they're confronted by the adult? Kind of tells us where we're at in this. Were they just exploring, and you know what, we don't take our clothes off with people we don't know like that, and they go, oh, okay, and they're fine, then we're just moving along. But I think when the child's response or reaction is like all the way to, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway, then I think we know what kind of problem we have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Absolutely. And just a quick question that just came in, who asks if our helpline counselors are mandated reporters. We are all mandated reporters, but our helpline is mostly anonymous and confidential. We don't ask for identifying information. We do not track phone numbers. And we have, though, reached out to authorities when we have a concern, and we have a reporting decision tree that helps us know when we have enough identifying information that meets the criteria for a report to Child Protection Services or to the police, and actually on one case even to the FBI. But our goal is mostly to attempt to get folks to identify local resources in their community that they can go to, who can begin to consult them and walk with them down whatever path they need to walk down in terms of getting support and resources for their children and protecting other children. So it's just always important for us to address that. So thank you for that question. What are we doing on time? We have just about 4 minutes left, and I'm looking to see if we have lots of great notes in the chat. I'm just trying to pull out any other questions. Micah, do you see anything? And Mackenzie, if I'm missing something, please speak up.
I think we have one more way back in the beginning. It says, you said walk through the process, but didn't really explain that. So they're talking about the legal process, potentially the social services process. Does CPS take the child? Is the child registered? Does it depend on their age and the age of the victim? Does it depend on state? Does CPS remove the kid? And does the school get informed? So that's a lot of questions. So is there anything, I think, that you can kind of say more generally about the process that CPS does for these older children? So we're primarily talking about older youth, teenagers, when they get involved with a case of child sexual harm.
So when I was referring to the process, it was around the issue of parents calling and wanting to tell you as the therapist about what their child has done, and explaining that you're a mandated reporter, as walking through the process is, let's make the call together to Child Protective Services. And much like Jenny was saying, help the parent kind of coach them what they're supposed to say, but do it together. Also be available to Child Protective Services for interviews, since you've talked to them. Because I think that's the point I want to make, is that's often rare as a therapist, that you might get that call before they've been to Child Protective Services. And so they're a lot more anxious. A lot of times we get, as therapists, we get cases after they've talked to everybody.
Right. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Well, we're going to get ready to wrap up, although there's one very final question that I just want to address, because it really spoke to the heart of so much of what we do around prevention. And it's such a good question. At what age do you start educating potential victims? Why do preschoolers get taught how to keep their teeth safe from cavities, but not their bodies safe from pedophiles? And, what I want to say is that we start educating children about their bodies and healthy sexual behaviors and relationships as soon as we're able, through modeling, through practice, through respecting boundaries and teaching about privacy and consent. But I'd love to offer you all a different framework. But certainly it's always hard to think about someone as a potential victim. And that Stop It Now, part of our unique focus is really focused on how to help prevent sexual abuse through perpetrator prevention. So we often have looked at, through the history of sexual violence, that we talk about how a woman can prevent being raped. What we really want to focus on is people who are at risk of harming someone, how to make sure they have the support and resources so that we're taking advantage of opportunities to intervene and to interrupt that trajectory of harmful behavior. So if we do want to help children protect themselves, to have information, to know who to trust, to ask about questions they have, to have the right words for their body parts. And we absolutely need to, as adults, know what we need to do to strengthen environments, talk to children and other adults about their sexual behaviors, and also address, certain community and societal concerns around the safety of environments and the policies, and all the way up to the laws that we have that help us dictate what's needed for prevention. So that's about an 8-hour training I had to say in 30 seconds because that question is so critically important. Becky, we can't thank you enough. I think we probably could talk about this for hours and hours, but you've really shed some light. You've really brought a compassionate lens and given us some very specific strategies and tips. And thank you for your time for doing this.
You are more than welcome. Anytime, Jenny.
Thank you.
Anytime, Micah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to all of you who are out there. I know that we may not have gotten to every question. Please feel free to write in. Please visit our resources. There are handouts attached. You will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording and to the survey that we hope you'll do. Please stay tuned for our April communications, and you all just take really good care as you all are keeping your homes as safe as possible. Be well, everyone.